Hello friends, welcome to the last video in this Nietzsche November series where we tackled a major work from Friedrich Nietzsche every single week, talked about core concepts, themes, how they connect, and a whole lot more. So in this last video, we're covering possibly his most famous work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And quick disclaimer again, with this series, these aren't the deepest analysis. I don't come from any academic background, but what this is more so explaining my own interpretation, walking through things that stood out to me, discussing the core concepts, and more importantly, having that back and forth with you guys as well in the comments below so we can kind of enjoy this dissection as we all read Nietzsche together. Another thing to note before we dig into the text itself is the page numbers, the quotes will all be from this translation, R.J. Hollinsdale, this Penguin edition. So keep that in mind as well. So without further ado, let's dig into this masterpiece. And that's exactly what it is. It's a masterpiece. And I didn't really understand that the first time I read it. It was very confusing. I didn't fully know what's going on. And that's because this book requires a lot of context. And I've talked about that in previous videos in this series as well. But even more so in this book, you don't just need the context of Kant, of Descartes, of historical context of what's going on in Germany, and more importantly, overall within Western Europe, the whole Enlightenment period. You also need context within Nietzsche and his philosophies. You need to truly understand what this Übermensch is, what these higher men are, eternal recurrence, will to power, the reevaluation of all values. Yes, you're going to get a better understanding of all those concepts through reading this book, but you need to have a little bit of introductory knowledge because a lot of this book is a kind of almost like a fictional retelling that's incorporating all this context. So you're following this figure, Zarathustra, which we'll get into in a moment. But a lot of this is kind of a fictional story that Nietzsche is telling, but he's intertwining really deep philosophical context or concepts, I should say, within this book. So that's my first point, just to say right out the gate, is the first time you read this, if you've never read it before, don't stress it. Just get through it, absorb as much as you can. That's my recommendation to all hard books, whether it is Kant or Hegel or whomever, is just don't stress it too much on the first pass. Get the first pass through with the book, and if you take notes properly and if you really make the effort, like me, the second time you read this, you'll realize, wow, I understand why people hail this book so much, why it is presented as such a masterpiece and quite possibly his best work. Now, as it relates to the title of the book and the main figure, Zarathustra, who is that? What is that about? So Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, is a historical figure from Zoroastrianism, which I believe originated within modern-day Iran, but it was really within that Persian area around, I think, 1000 to 1500 BC. Nietzsche leverages that primarily because Zoroaster and Zoroastrianism was one of the first monotheistic religion, and also Zoroaster himself has a lot of resemblances to Jesus. And so he comes down essentially as very much a prophet or as a savior to man, which we'll get into the broad overarching plot in a moment. But that's kind of who Nietzsche is referencing by using the name Zarathustra, and kind of just uses this historical figure as a mouthpiece for Nietzsche's main ideas. And throughout the story, again, he's running into different places. He runs into the marketplace. He runs into this tightrope scene, which we'll get into pretty early in the book. He speaks to priests. Later in the book, he's running into a bunch of these different figures. He's kind of picking up and developing this almost like cast of misfits, so to speak. He's got, a leech, a sorcerer, the ugliest man. He's got a beggar with him. He's got all these different kind of outcasts that he kind of brings together. And this is, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of resemblances or connections to the Gospels. So the four Gospels of Christianity, he's playing on a lot of those storylines or plots within this book. And you see it referenced almost quite obviously, explicitly, too, when he has chapters such as the Last Supper, of course referencing the Last Supper that Jesus had as well with his disciples. There's a lot of playing on historical references, like I mentioned Zarathustra, but also intertwining some of those Christianic figures as well. As I mentioned earlier, there is a bit of an overarching plot throughout the story, but I would say that the plot is less important, but what's more important is the specific characters and the scenes and the conversations, the dialogue that occurs within the different chapters that matters more than, let's say, the overarching theme throughout the story. So more the interactions between Zarathustra and the people, rather than where Zarathustra is going overall. So what Zarathustra is doing is he's coming down from this cave. He was in this place of solitude, and he's coming down to save man. He looks down, he sees society, humanity is in a state of decadence. Morality, Christianity, religion overall has kind of created, it's turned man into herd animal. It's turned him into a follower. There's less leaders. He's weak, he's oppressed, he's timid, he's cowardly. And so Zarathustra is coming down to essentially preach Nietzsche's philosophy about the Übermensch and how man must learn to overcome himself, which is a very important phrase that kind of gets repeated out throughout the work. Is man learning to overcome man or overcome himself? And a lot of this is going to be praising the higher men of society, those that can become essentially leaders and commanders and create their own values, builders of values, not so dependent on these moral values or moral structures that have been created by religion, by society, by your current government or something like that, but a true empowered individual. Essentially, Zarathustra is trying to teach man to reject these life-denying principles, this asceticism that's being practiced that only turns men into these kind of moderate, average, temperate human beings, and is advocating for man to supersede that and become greater and reach the heights and hopefully bring upon us or bring forth the Übermensch. So you see Übermensch, you see will to power is a very key theme, because that's what these higher men possess. They possess will to power. They really embrace it rather than trying to resist it or deny it. You also see eternal recurrence mentioned as well throughout the work. And then you have this reevaluation of all values. So plenty of talk on morality as well. So all the books that we just covered within this mini series of On the Genealogy of Morals, Beyond Good and Evil, The Gay Science, and even some elements of Birth of Tragedy, it all gets woven in to this final kind of pinnacle work. Even though this came out before some of those, this is where it all kind of gets merged into it, which makes it, again, a little bit tricky because there's a lot going on here. Starting with the prologue, we see a little bit of what I was discussing earlier, where Zarathustra has been in this cave for 10 years, he's in solitude, and he desires to come down to mankind. He says on page 39, this cup wants to be empty again, and Zarathustra wants to be man again. And on the next page, we see that it says on page 40, Zarathustra has become a child, an awakened one, which we'll get into that kind of child connection in a moment with the Three Metamorphoses. And then in the next sentence, you lived in solitude as in the sea, and the sea bore you. So it's kind of interesting that Zarathustra, who kind of represents this higher man, he kind of got tired of being in solitude. So there's this idea that the Übermensch, or the higher men, are kind of nothing in solitude, is how I interpret it. That there does need to be this progressing of the human species, or of mankind, of society, and that if you were just doing that on an island, it really wouldn't be much. So Nietzsche does have this, because I think sometimes you can interpret Nietzsche's philosophy as very egotistic, it's just centered around these great men of society. But you can see that he does have this concern and love for mankind as a whole, and wants to see it reach its greatest potential. He wants to see mankind reach, its greatest heights. Maybe not every single individual in mankind, but at least the species overall, he wants to see kind of rise. So it couldn't occur just in a vacuum. And then on page 41, this is what I was mentioning earlier. He says, I teach you the Superman. Man is something that should be overcome. And I like this reference to same page right below it, where he says, all creatures hitherto have created something beyond themselves. And do you want to be the ebb of this great tide and return to the animals rather than overcome man? And so he's kind of talking about how mankind overcame being an animal, being a brute. As much as he believes that consciousness is our most quote-unquote unreliable organ, we have transcended beyond the apes that we descended from, or that we evolved from, I should say. And how Nietzsche is positioning it is Zarathustra is to man as man is to ape. So like the Superman is kind of that next stage of our evolution. And what Nietzsche is positioning here is kind of that we're at this teetering point where we can revert back towards animals, or at least stay in this state of decadence and let morality and ascetic ideals and all this denial of the will keep us at this, keep us stagnant as a species or as a human race, or we can transcend through the values that Zarathustra promotes and advocates for. We can learn to overcome man and become the overman, become the superman, the Übermensch. On page 42, this is discussed a little bit, talking about the current state of society, where he says, "In truth, man is a polluted river. One must be a sea to receive a polluted river and not be defiled. Behold, I teach you the Superman. He is this sea. In him your great contempt can go under." So again, the Superman represents this savior of mankind who can withstand all the pollutants that have essentially corrupted man at this point. Moving further, we get a better description of how Nietzsche views the current state of society, where he says on page 46, "Nobody grows rich or poor anymore. Both are too much of a burden. Who still wants to rule? Who obey? Both are too much of a burden. No herdsman and one herd. Everyone wants the same thing. Everyone is the same. Whoever thinks otherwise goes voluntarily into the madhouse." So Nietzsche views mankind very much as just herd animals, just these animals that are have this second nature, as we discussed in last week's video, the second nature of obedience. All we want to do is follow, follow, follow. We're allowing all these influences to kind of overpower any of our individualities, and we become submerged into this universal. And this is again why he rejected Schopenhauer and some of these other philosophies that preach equality, or such as Christianity, equal under the eyes of God. We're all equal in his eyes. He rejected that. He did not think that we all shared an equal will, or that we were all equal in that way. He believed that there were higher men of society, and that by submerging everyone to kind of some mean or average is just mediocrity, and man is being turned into just this mediocre herd-like creature. As Nietzsche starts to round out this prologue, we start to see more about this Übermensch, this Superman. Where are we kind of leading to? And so at the bottom of page 51, he says, "Behold the good and the just. Whom do they hate the most? Him who smashes their tables of values, the breaker, the lawbreaker, but he is a creator." And then on the following page, "The creator seeks companions, not corpses or herds or believers. The creator seeks fellow creators, those who inscribe new values on new tables." So what Nietzsche is advocating for, what Zarathustra is trying to teach man, is to smash the old law tables, smash the old prejudices of morality, this idea of good and evil, right and wrong, all this truth seeking, all these universal values, this incorrect belief of piety going on. Erase all of that. Stop thinking and pursuing this common good, this happiness of the greatest number. All that's been pushed through English morality and English philosophers and a lot of Western philosophy up until this point. Get rid of all that, smash that, break the laws, the tablets, all of that, and be a creator, be an individual. And this is why Nietzsche is tied into existentialism, because he is an advocate of an individual superseding the community and self-defining his own values, creating his own purpose, not tying his purpose to some deity or some community or what he's supposed to do, all these thou shouts, rather turn it to I will, which leads us into the first section I want to dig into, which is the three metamorphoses. And this is Zarathustra's first discourse. I think it's one of the most important. We see a metamorphosis from the camel to the lion to the child, each representing a particular kind of phase of the spirit. So the first phase of the spirit is the camel. And this spirit is able or capable of handling the strongest, the heaviest, hardest burdens. So it's capable of suffering and withstanding some of the hardships, I guess, that an individual would take on, to be individualistic, to not be that herd animal. So we see here on page 54, quote, "The weight-bearing spirit takes upon itself all these heaviest things, like a camel hurrying laden into the desert, thus it hurries into its desert. But the camel has to transform into a lion because by itself in its current state, it's able to again carry all these burdens like a camel does, but it's not able to really enact anything new, to create any new values, to kind of provide much resistance. So this is where the lion comes in, and the lion is representing this push for freedom. It's a I will versus the thou shalt, and we see he creates this imagery where the lion is attacking and fighting and resisting this dragon. The dragon really represents religion or morality and those valuations. Quote, the great dragon is called thou shalt, but the spirit of the lion says I will. Thou shalt lies in its path, sparkling with gold, a scale-covered beast, and on every scale glitters golden thou shalt. Values of 1,000 years glitter on the scales, and thus speaks the mightiest of all dragons. All the values of things glitter on me. So again, this dragon is representing morality, thou shalt, duty, all that kind of bears upon an individual. The lion is resisting it and has this sacred no. Quote, to create new values, even the lion is incapable of that, but to create itself freedom for new creation, that the might of the lion can do. To create freedom for itself and a sacred no, even to duty, the lion is needed for that, my brother. So the lion is needed because the lion is capable of resisting and rejecting the current valuation. But the lion is incapable, as he says, of creating new values, of really creating itself. The lion can kind of capture freedom and reject, but it can't create. And that's why we need the child. So the final transformation occurs where the child comes in. And the child really represents new beginnings, a fresh start, a clean slate, a clean palette to really pull from. Quote, the child is innocence and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a sport, a self-propelling wheel, a first motion, a sacred yes. So if you think about it, what is the lion doing? It's resisting. It's a secondary action. It's resisting a primary force oppressing it, right? Whereas the child is, quote, a self-propelling wheel, a first motion. So the child is this sacred yes, this affirmation, this self-propelling wheel, this creator, as we kind of discussed in that prologue. Whereas the lion is still, it's pushing for freedom, but it's not capable of doing that. And obviously, the camel wasn't capable of getting freedom in the first place, just bearing the brunt, basically, that society was placing upon it. So this is kind of what goes on. These are how the spirit metamorphosizes three different ways and eventually leads to this higher man. And this new evaluation apparently occurs through the child. Moving on to Of the Way of the Creator, we do see a little bit of what these new values, what this creator is supposed to be capable of, but more so, we see a bit of caution professed to these potential creators. Like, do you really want to go through this? Because it's going to be a really hard, lonely path. It's going to be icy, and it's going to be full of attacks and ostracism and all of that. So it's almost like a forewarning a little bit. We see here on page 88, he who seeks may easily get lost himself. It is a crime to go apart and be alone. Thus speaks the herd. So the herd, again, is going to ostracize you. They're going to denounce you because you are in resistance or in opposition to them, right? You're the individual, you're the outcast against the community. They're going to look at you as a potential threat, essentially is what he's saying here. Quote, but you want to go the way of your affliction, which is the way to yourself. If so, show me your strength for it and your right to it. A self-propelling wheel, can you also compel stars to revolve about you? Can you be this creator? And why he questions that is because later on page 89, I like this kind of imagery or metaphor where he says, do you call yourself free? I want to hear your ruling idea and not that you have escaped from a yoke. If we're just a herd animal, as he keeps kind of referencing, and we're stuck in a yoke, and maybe we've escaped the yoke, but we're still by our nature, our inner nature is still a follower. That's what he's kind of getting at here. Are you just a follower that has kind of been outcast by the community, that has escaped the yoke, but you're still at heart just a follower, you're still a herd animal? Or are you truly a creator? Are you truly capable of that internal freedom? Then later down here on page 89, he kind of references again that resistance you're going to experience from those around you or society at whole. You compel many to change their opinion about you. They hold that very much against you. You approach them and yet went on past them. that they will never forgive you. You go above and beyond them, but the higher you climb, the smaller you appear to the eye of envy, and he who flies is hated most of all. So again, this is kind of like the classic phrase that you hear in the business world or whatever. Everyone wants to see you doing well, just not better than them, right? Because once you start doing better than them and they have to look up to you or quote, you're flying above them, then they're going to start to have envy for you because you're transcending them. So there's that resentment occurring here. And the last quote I'll reference from this section, it's one of my favorite quotes, maybe from all of Nietzsche's books. I just think it's beautiful. Page 90, you must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you become new if you had not first become ashes? I just love that. I feel like you have to kind of go through this place of not just suffering, of bearing hardship, but internal suffering. You have to go and experience this kind of internal fire within yourself to not just become ashes, but be born from the ashes. How can you become new if you don't become ashes first? I really think of the imagery too of like a phoenix being burned from the ashes. So we kind of have to destroy and overcome our former selves to become a better future self. Further on in Of Self-Overcoming, we start to see more of the description of what this individual, this higher man, the overman, is going to be capable of. So we see, again, as I mentioned earlier, most of mankind, and this is true to today. I don't think it's some massive enlightenment to say that most people are followers. Most people are very obedient. They look to others for what they should do. What career should I get? Where should I go to school? What music am I supposed to like? They just look to their peers. They look to society. So I don't think that's a stretch or something convoluted to say. So he kind of references that a lot of people are going to be commanded. They're going to obey. He says, quote, he who cannot obey himself will be commanded. So if you can't create your own kind of values, your own interpretation, lead yourself, you're going to be led by others. But it's the rare individual that enacts his will to power, that is a leader, that is creating his own values, creating his own laws, defining his own duty and rights. That is the person that can transcend. Those are the rare individuals in history that we look up to, and we can mark them as extraordinary because they aren't looking to others. They aren't the followers, the obedient within society. And right before he ends the section, he points out that these lawmakers are kind of doing the same thing as the individual. So we look at the individual who's maybe living life by their own rule set, right? Creating their own laws, creating their own values, rejecting morality, some broad, overarching, universal morality, focuses on that subjectivity. And we might say that's self-centered. That's egotistic. You're making it up as you go. We should apply something to everybody. But he points out that whether it's the church, religion, or government, they're doing the same thing. Just they're doing it as a larger entity, but they're still doing that law creating an exertion of power. So it says, quote, you exert power with your values and doctrines of good and evil, you assessors of values. A little bit further on, he says, and he who has to be a creator in good and evil truly has to be a destroyer and break values. So as much as we accept maybe the current moral structures of today, those are only there today because they were created by destroying older values. And that connects really well to the chapter of Old and New Law Tables, which is a little bit of a longer section, but really digs deeper into this idea of creating values and rejecting old ones or current ones. So in section 2, he's talking about how man is kind of in this state of sleeping and peaceful slumber because he knows good and evil, and it's universal, and it's been scientifically figured out, and it's just true, right? Of course, Nietzsche rejects this. Quote, I disturb the somnolence when I taught that nobody yet knows what is good and evil unless it be the Creator. But he it is who creates a goal for mankind and gives the earth its meaning and its future. He it is who creates the equality of good and evil in things. And what I believe Nietzsche is getting at there is that the only objective morality that could exist would be from a creator, from a deity that would come down and have that divine morality. But other than that, it's subjective. What your government, your religion, your local community allows or deems as morally righteous, that's going to be a subjective matter. No matter how much we pursue this idea of objective morality, it just doesn't exist. We can't really prove it. And this is something I expanded upon way better in Beyond Good and Evil. So if you're interested more in that attack on morality and that criticism of it, Go watch that video. Dug a lot deeper, more into that. But again, Nietzsche's getting at this idea of getting away from thou shalt, a bunch of duty, a bunch of obedience to these kind of arbitrary, as he would probably put them, laws that have been created by religion. So in that section, I think what Nietzsche's getting at is man has a lot of peace in morality when he believes it to be objective. When he believes that there's some divine power that has come down and created these law tables, created these commandments, these values, a bunch of thou shalts that we should follow. But once God is dead, as Nietzsche posits and puts forth in a number of his works, or once we leave religion, we turn towards science, no matter how much we try, we cannot reach some objective morality. It's always going to come down to subjectivity. Your government, your religion, they're kind of coming up with their set of laws and rules. They're being the new creator of values. And so that's why Nietzsche is positing that the individual should just be the creator of their own values, rather than obeying others, being commanded by others that are enacting this will of power, then criticizing you for enacting your own will to power. So it's a little bit hypocritical there. And that's why Zarathustra has come down to try and save and teach mankind some of these ways. So we see on page 216, quote, I taught them to create the future and to redeem by creating all that was past, to redeem that past of mankind and to transform every it was until the will says, but I willed it thus, so shall I will it. Again, rejecting any thou shalt or idea of duty or responsibility in that way. And like I mentioned, this chapter is quite long, but there's one more section I want to point out, and that's section 8, where he uses this imagery of planks across water. And so the planks kind of represent that conception of good and evil, that as long as the planks are there and the water's stable, we can walk across, we can kind of live in this state of ignorance, and ignorance is bliss. And we have this conception, society, morality feels fixed. But as soon as this harsh, raging wind comes in and breaks the railways and paths, we see things kind of come into chaos. So it's like once that ignorance, once that worldview of good and evil, that conception, the comfort that brings, once that gets shaken up and someone like Nietzsche points out the hypocrisy or the flaws or the errors of it, punches holes into it, now everything is kind of going to hell. He says, quote, oh, my brothers, is everything not now in flux? Have not all railings and gangways fallen into the water and come to nothing? Who can still cling to good and evil? So again, fallen into the water, have no more guardrails. The rails are off, and it's kind of chaos when we don't have objective morality to fall back on. And the last chapter I want to discuss is of the higher man. This is where we see what the higher men are capable of, what they're working towards, and ideally who they can bring about, being the overman. So in section number 1, we see, this is quoting the mob that is speaking here, quote, there are no higher men, we are all equal. Man is but man before God. We are all equal before God, but now this God has died, and let us not be equal before the mob. You higher men, depart from the marketplace. And that's tying everything back to that marketplace scene in The Gay Science, where the madman comes in and he's questioning everybody, where's God, where's God? And they inform him that God is dead. And not only that, but we have killed him. And what he means by we have killed him, humanity overall has killed him through the Age of Enlightenment, reason, scientific discoveries, Darwinism, all of that. And society has become secularized and transcended beyond religious dogmatism. And building upon this in section 2, near the bottom, he says, quote, God has died, now we desire that the Superman shall live. And earlier in that, he says that God was their greatest danger to the higher men. And this is because morality and religion represented constraints and limitations upon man. Because a lot of the virtues, or as Nietzsche describes them as petty virtues, that religion professes, whether it be obedience, whether it be this asceticism, bad conscience, guilt, all of these values limit man. They tell him and teach him to deny his desires, his will to power, reject that. Whereas once that burden and those constraints have been lifted, those chains are broken, now man can reach his greatest heights. He can enact and embody that will to power, seek growth, let his will flourish, and hopefully that Superman will arrive. So again, on this back page on section 3, page 298, quote, overcome, you higher man, the petty virtues, the petty prudences, the sand-grained discretion, the ant-swarm inanity, miserable ease, the, quote, happiness of the greatest number. Again, because this idea of treating everyone and submerging everyone to this equal state, trying to squish everyone to this average mean, the state of mediocrity, it doesn't really do much impact wise to the people that would normally be lower in society, but what it does is it caps off the rare individuals, the extraordinary ones, from reaching great heights. It prevents anyone from enacting their own individuality and keeps them all in that universal mediocre herd-like state. Building upon that, on the next page, 299, section 5, we see, quote, man is evil, all the wisest men have told me that to comfort me. Ah, if only it be true today, for evil is man's best strength. So here we see an interesting situation where Nietzsche is actually, he's pointing out that religion, morality, society overall, civilization has taught man to reject and suppress his instincts, that our animalistic instincts, our psychopathic instincts are to be rejected. That will to power, that desire, that longing for growth, for transcendence, we should reject that. But Nietzsche seems to be advocating for the opposite. He advocates that we not only leverage those instincts, but enhance them if possible. Quote, man must grow better and more evil, thus do I teach. The most evil is necessary for the Superman's best. And he says that it's not for everybody. This isn't, for all individuals, but only the highest men. Quote, but these things are not said for long ears, neither does every word belong in every mouth. They are subtle, remote things. Sheep's hooves ought not to grasp for them. So, and this, a good point of reference is to think about Napoleon. This is a figure that Nietzsche discusses a lot, that does seem to represent one of Nietzsche's kind of archetypes for what a higher man is. This is a man that reached great heights, that was praised, that had statues made of him, right? Yet he was murderous. He was oppressive. He was tyrannical. He was trying to grow his empire. He led, as much as he led a lot of great wars, these wars led to absolute bloodbaths. He was not following any kind of moral structure or laws or anything besides his own self-determination, his own self-values, his own self-defined goals. And so Napoleon and these higher men, what Nietzsche thinks that they represent, or what they should represent, is the kind of embodiment of these raw animalistic instincts that man still has, the true fullest exertion of will to power. So again, this is not going to be something that everyone agrees with, and it's not even something that perhaps Nietzsche meant to be enacted fully in society, or at least in the most violent ways. It's just an easy way to think about it, right? When we think about power and aggression and oppression, we naturally think of maybe the worst figures in history, or at least the most aggressive figures in history. But this could apply in different scenarios as well. At least that's how I like to interpret it and think about it. And I should clarify, it's not that these instincts should be completely unchecked and allowed to roam free and wild, but that they should be channeled and leveraged and used for the good of that individual, or the good of mankind, of that species specifically. Not the good of the greatest number. Definitely not that. That's not what Nietzsche's advocating for. But to bring up the Superman, to kind of have mankind transcend overall. Because he says, quote, I do not want to conduct it away. It shall learn to work for me. So that's, again, what I was getting at. This idea of channeling it, not letting the animalistic instincts run truly wild. And we see through section 7 through 9 that these higher men are not coming down like Zarathustra to try and save mankind. They're not trying to save the mob, save the herd. They're trying to save and teach the select few. That's what the higher men and what Zarathustra is really trying to do. He's not trying to save everybody, but save the few that are capable of being saved, so to speak. So he says, quote, it's on page 300, who could overturn with reasons what the mob has once learned to believe without reasons? They boast that they do not tell lies, but inability to lie is far from being love of truth. Be on your guard. And then in section 11, we see it all come full circle a little bit, connecting back to the Metamorphoses and this conception of child. Because he says, quote, you creators, you higher men, one is pregnant only with one's own child. And then moving on to section 12, quote, "You creators, there is much in you that is unclean. That is because you have to be mothers, a new child. Oh, how much new filth has entered the world. Go aside, and whoever has given birth shall wash his soul clean." So we're covered in filth. We're covered by these prejudices, these errors, these mistakes of society, all the suppression of instincts, and we have to be born anew. And this is again connecting back to that quote about becoming ashes. It connects back to the camel to the lion has to be born anew as a child. And it's important that we're not just kind of born anew as an adult. We have to be born as a newborn. We have to kind of completely blank, clean slate, start from fresh, and that's really what ideally these higher men are bringing about is like a new age of society, full of empowered leaders and individuals. And the last section I'll cover here from this chapter is section 19. I really like this where he says, quote, "But better to be foolish with happiness than foolish with misfortune. Better to dance clumsily than to walk lamely." And to me, what he's getting at here is that it's better for the higher men to not have certainty, to not have absolute truth, and to kind of create their own path and maybe stumble upon, a time or two. But embrace that happiness, embrace the clumsiness, and dance. Life is this dance, right? Full of passion, full of our desires and our will, and it's not so mechanistic, right, as science would have it. And those who walk lamely is representing those who are angry and resentful in society, those lower classes, those lower individuals that are incapable of enacting those self-defining features and traits of the higher men. So that's it for this video, the book and the series. Nietzsche November comes to a conclusion. I had a blast rereading a lot of these works, reading some new ones, seeing how they connect, and furthering my own education with this. Because again, a lot of these books, they don't take a first read. They take a second, a third, a fourth. And again, this book was challenging. I didn't even reread the whole thing, but a lot of these sections take deep analysis. They take deep focus, and I can't wait to reread it again in the future. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are. What sections stood out to you? What did I get right, wrong? Your own interpretations, let me know in the comments below. Hopefully you enjoy this series, and if you haven't read any of these books, you can come back to this series at some point and see my own interpretation of it, share yours. I'd love to hear from you guys. And now, moving on to this channel, I'm excited to dig into more concept videos, more broader discussions rather than these long, strict analysis type videos. So keep an eye out for that. Subscribe for more content coming up in 2024. Like the video if you enjoy it, and I will catch you guys in the next one.